The sound that cut through the humid, stagnant air of the Nui Dat base in March 1968 was not the rhythmic thumping of helicopter rotors, nor was it the distant, rolling thunder of artillery fire that had become the background static of the Vietnam War. It was the high-pitched, grinding screech of metal biting into metal. It was the sound of a hacksaw destroying government property. Standing on the edge of the perimeter, a United States Army Green Beret captain, a man whose uniform was pressed with a sharpness that defied the jungle heat, watched in open disbelief. Before him, in a dusty, oil-stained garage requisitioned by the Australian Special Air Service Regiment, a group of soldiers were committing what appeared to be a cardinal sin of military discipline. They were taking their standard-issue L1A1 self-loading rifles, precision instruments of war renowned for their accuracy and reliability, and they were sawing the barrels off. They weren't waiting for armorers. They weren't following a technical order from headquarters. They were hunched over vices, sweat dripping from their shirtless torsos, hacking away at the steel with a grim industrial focus. To the American captain, whose military upbringing was built on the pillars of standardization, maintenance, and technological superiority, this was not just unprofessional, it was insanity. He turned to his executive officer, a smirk playing on his lips, and gestured toward the Australians with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Look at them," he said, his voice carrying the confidence of a superpower. "They're butchering their own gear. Those idiots won't last a week out there." He laughed then. It was a laugh born of doctrine, of the absolute certainty that the American way of war, massive firepower, technological dominance, and overwhelming logistics, was the only way. He could not have known that within 6 days that laugh would die in his throat. He could not have foreseen that he would be lying face down in the red dirt of Long Con province, screaming into a radio handset as his company disintegrated around him, begging for salvation from the very men he was currently mocking. He certainly could not have understood that the butchered rifles he was sneering at were not the product of ignorance, but of a terrifyingly advanced evolution that the Pentagon was too proud to recognize. The hacksaw was not destroying the weapon. It was adapting it to a reality that American manuals refused to acknowledge. But the weapons were only the visible surface of a much deeper, more disturbing divergence in philosophy. To understand why the Green Beret was wrong, and why his doctrine was about to lead his men into a slaughter, one must look through the eyes of the American intelligence officer who arrived at Nui Dat later that same afternoon. When the intelligence officer stepped off the skid of his Huey helicopter, the first thing that hit him was not the heat, but the smell. It was a physical wall of odor that seemed to possess a biological density. It was not merely the smell of unwashed bodies. It was something far more complex and aggressive. It layered the copper tang of old blood with the sourness of fermented fish, the damp rot of decaying vegetation, and the stagnant funk of standing water. It was the smell of decomposition. His immediate physiological reaction was to cover his nose and mouth with a handkerchief. He had been in country for 18 months. He had walked through field hospitals after mass casualty events. He had stood downwind of burning latrines. He had visited villages leveled by napalm. He thought he knew the olfactory landscape of the war. He was wrong. The scent emanating from the Australian SAS troopers preparing for a patrol 40 meters away was unlike anything he had encountered in a friendly base. It suggested a total collapse of discipline, a level of neglect that bordered on the feral. The American officer marched toward the nearest Australian lieutenant, his mind already drafting a report on the breakdown of hygiene standards among Allied forces. He intended to offer logistical support, soap, showers, perhaps a medical team to check for skin infections. He assumed they had run out of supplies. When he confronted the Australian, demanding an explanation for the squalor, the response he received was delivered with a flat, cold stare that unsettled him more than the smell itself. "We don't smell like rot because we're dirty, mate," the Australian said, his voice dropping to a low register. "We smell like rot because the jungle smells like rot. And that's why we come home, and your boys go home in aluminum boxes." The American stopped. The arrogance evaporated, replaced by a sudden, jarring confusion. The Australian went on to explain a concept that was completely alien to U.S. military doctrine: scent discipline. The United States Army operated on the belief that a clean soldier was a disciplined soldier. Every GI was issued a hygiene kit containing bar soap, shaving cream, toothpaste, and deodorant. In the rear echelon, and even at fire bases, soldiers were encouraged to shower daily. They smoked American cigarettes, Marlboros and Salems, that smelled of sweet Virginia tobacco and curing sugar. They chewed American gum. They washed their fatigues in strong detergents. To the American command, this was civilization holding back the chaos of the bush. To the Viet Cong trackers, it was a beacon. Interrogations of captured enemy scouts had revealed a humiliating truth. American patrols could be detected by smell alone from distances exceeding 500 meters. In the humid, heavy air of the canopy, the scent of Old Spice deodorant or Colgate toothpaste lingered for hours, drifting along the jungle floor like a chemical trail. An enemy sentry didn't need to see the Americans. He could smell the soap on their skin long before they came into visual range. The sweet smoke of a Marlboro could be detected a kilometer away by a nose accustomed to the organic smells of the forest. The Australians had eliminated this signature entirely. The filth, the intelligence officer observed, was a calculated tactical decision. 2 weeks prior to any long-range patrol, SAS troopers stopped using all commercial hygiene products. They abandoned soap. They stopped shaving. They switched from toothpaste to brushing with salt or baking soda. They stopped smoking Western tobacco, switching to harsh local leaf or quitting entirely. They changed their diet, consuming indigenous foods and heavy amounts of nuoc mam, the fermented fish sauce staple of the Vietnamese diet, which fundamentally altered the chemical composition of their sweat. By the time they stepped outside the wire for insertion, they did not smell like Westerners. They smelled like mud, sweat, and rotting leaves. They had erased the chemical disparity between themselves and the environment. In verified incidents, Viet Cong patrols had walked within 2 meters of concealed Australian positions, the enemy soldiers' senses registering nothing but the background scent of the jungle. One report detailed an incident where a Viet Cong fighter had physically stepped on an Australian trooper's boot, looked down, saw only what appeared to be a muddy log, and continued walking. The trooper had not moved. He had not smelled like a threat. He had become a ghost. But if the smell was a shock to the American officer's sensibilities, the weapons were an affront to his professional training. He moved to the armory tables where the modifications were taking place. He picked up one of the rifles, the steel still warm from the friction of the saw. It was a bastardization of the L1A1. The barrel had been lopped off, removing nearly 15 centimeters of rifling. The flash suppressor, designed to hide the muzzle blast at night, was gone. A crude vertical foregrip, welded from scrap metal or carved from hardwood, had been bolted under the handguard. It looked like a weapon cobbled together by a desperate partisan in a basement, not the primary arm of an elite Commonwealth soldier. "You've ruined the ballistics," the American officer stated, pointing at the jagged crown of the barrel. "The effective range on this platform is supposed to be 400 meters. You'll be lucky to hit a barn at 100. It's loud, it has no flash suppression, and you've destroyed the muzzle velocity." The Australian armorer didn't look up from his work. "Have you ever measured the visibility in the scrub, Captain?" he asked. 10 meters. 15 on a good day. If I can see him at 400 meters, I'm not in the jungle, I'm on a paddy dike, and I've already made a mistake." He held up the shortened weapon. They called it the bitch. It was ugly, loud, and vicious. The logic was brutal. In the claustrophobic confines of the bamboo thickets, a long rifle was a liability. It snagged on vines. It caught on wait-a-minute bushes. Every snag required a pause to untangle. Every pause created noise. Every noise invited death. The shortened barrel slid through the vegetation like a snake. And the loss of long-range accuracy? Irrelevant. In a contact that happens at 5 meters, you don't need a minute of angle group. You need stopping power. The standard American M16 fired a 5.56 millimeter round, small, fast, designed for distance. At close range in the jungle, the high-velocity round often passed clean through an adrenaline-fueled enemy fighter, wounding him but leaving him capable of emptying his AK-47 magazine before he died. The Australian 7.62 millimeter round, tumbling out of a sawed-off barrel, hit like a sledgehammer. It didn't punch a neat hole. It shattered bone and pulped tissue. It ignored the cover of bamboo trunks that deflected lighter rounds. The bitch was not designed for a rifle range. It was designed for a knife fight in a phone booth. As the American officer processed this heresy, his gaze drifted downward, and his confusion deepened into something bordering on disorientation. Several of the Australian troopers were not lacing up combat boots. They were strapping on sandals. Crude, black rubber sandals cut from used automobile tires with straps fashioned from inner tubes. The American recognized them instantly. They were Ho Chi Minh sandals, the standard-issue footwear of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army. "You're wearing enemy kit," the American said, his voice rising. "If you step on a mine, there's no protection. If you get into a firefight, you have no ankle support. And friendly forces will think you're VC. "Exactly," the Australian replied. "And so will the VC trackers." This was a level of psychological warfare the American doctrine had never contemplated. Tracking was the primary hunting method of the jungle. Every American jungle boot left a distinct, heavy tread pattern, a signature that shouted US infantry to any experienced scout. A Viet Cong tracker finding an American boot print could tell the unit size, the speed of movement, the weight of the packs, and the direction of travel. He could call in mortar fire or set an ambush miles ahead. But the Australians had hacked the system. By wearing the enemy's shoes, they left tracks that were indistinguishable from the local forces. A Viet Cong scout stumbling upon their trail would assume he was following a friendly unit. He wouldn't raise the alarm. He wouldn't set a claymore mine. He might even hurry to catch up, walking directly into the Australian rear security. Furthermore, the Australians employed counter-tracking techniques that bordered on the obsessive. They walked in stream beds for kilometers to leave no trace at all. They stepped on rocks and roots, avoiding soft mud. The last man in the patrol carried a branch, brushing out the few signs they did leave. They moved through the jungle not as conquerors trying to pave a road, but as fluid entities trying to leave the water undisturbed. The Viet Cong, who had successfully tracked the French and the Americans for decades, found themselves blind against the Australians. They called them Rung, phantoms of the jungle. The hunters had become the hunted because the prey had simply ceased to exist. There was one final element that the intelligence officer noted, a difference in attitude that unsettled him perhaps most of all. It was the way the Australians spoke about the enemy. In the American mess halls, the Viet Cong were Charlie, Gooks, Dinks, or Slopes. The language was derogatory, dismissive, filled with the racial contempt of a technologically superior force fighting a primitive enemy. The assumption was that the enemy was inferior, a pest to be exterminated. The Australians, however, referred to the enemy as Mr. Charles. It wasn't sarcasm. It was a formal address. It was respect. The Australians understood something the Americans did not. The Viet Cong had been fighting in these jungles for 20 years. They had beaten the Japanese. They had beaten the French. They were masters of their environment. To underestimate them was fatal. To hate them was a distraction. The Australians studied Mr. Charles with the intensity of an anthropologist. They analyzed his tactics not to mock them, but to learn from them. They respected his ability to endure, to hide, to kill. This lack of arrogance meant that Australian patrols never assumed they were safe. They never assumed their technology would save them. American patrols often walked into ambushes because they believed their firepower made them invincible. Australian patrols survived because they assumed they were vulnerable every second they were outside the wire. But all of this, the smell, the weapons, the sandals, the respect, was merely the foundation for the single most radical divergence in doctrine. It was the issue of speed. And this was the element that drove the American observers to the brink of professional fury. The United States military was built on the principles of World War II: aggression, momentum, seizing the initiative. Speed was security. If you moved fast, you were a harder target. American Long-Range Reconnaissance Patrols, LRRPs, considered a pace of 2 to 3 kilometers a day to be slow, cautious movement. When the Australian patrol leader told the American intelligence officer their standard rate of advance, the American thought he had misheard. 100 to 200 meters per hour, the Australian said. The American laughed. You mean kilometers? No, the Australian corrected. Meters. If we move a kilometer in a day, we are rushing. 100 meters an hour. It seemed operationally absurd. It was a snail's pace. It meant that crossing a single grid square on a map took an entire day. It implied a lack of aggression that bordered on cowardice. The American demanded a demonstration. He wanted to see what 100 meters an hour looked like, convinced it was an exaggeration. The Australian sergeant nodded and led him to a patch of dense scrub just outside the perimeter wire. "Watch," he said, "and listen." 4 SAS troopers entered the vegetation. The American stood 15 meters away, arms crossed, waiting for the sound of snapping twigs, the rustle of dry leaves, the clinking of gear. He heard nothing. He watched as the point man lifted a leg. The motion was agonizingly slow, a fluid hydraulic movement that took 10 seconds to complete. The boot hovered over the ground, the trooper sensing the terrain through the thin rubber sole of his sandal. He was feeling for dry sticks that might snap, for loose rocks that might shift. He placed the foot down, rolling his weight from the outside edge to the inside, compressing the leaf litter silently rather than crunching it. Then the patrol froze. They didn't just stop walking, they ceased to exist as biological entities. They held the pose for 4 minutes. Sweat rolled down their faces, mosquitoes landed on their eyelids, biting insects crawled into their shirts. They did not twitch, they did not slap, they did not wipe the sweat away. They stood like statues in a garden of green hell. Their eyes moved, scanning the canopy, scanning the shadows, dissecting the visual field into grid squares. Their nostrils flared, testing the air for the scent of cooked rice or unwashed bodies or gun oil. They were listening not just for the enemy, but for the absence of noise, the silence of birds that indicated a human presence nearby. After 4 minutes of absolute statuary stillness, they took another step. Another 4 minutes of observation. In 30 minutes, they covered 50 meters. The American officer, standing in plain sight, felt a chill crawl up his spine in the sweltering heat. He realized that if he had been looking the other way, he would never have known they were there. He realized that an American patrol moving at 2 kilometers an hour was, by comparison, a stampede of elephants. American soldiers crashed through the bush. They cut vines. They broke branches. They created a ripple of disturbance in the jungle's ecosystem that traveled hundreds of meters ahead of them. Birds flew away. Monkeys screamed warnings. The Viet Cong listening posts knew the Americans were coming 20 minutes before they made contact. But at 100 meters an hour, there was no ripple. The jungle absorbed the Australians. The birds kept singing. The insects kept droning. The ecosystem remained undisturbed. The Australians didn't move through the jungle. They became the jungle. They were not an invading force. They were a part of the landscape. And because they moved so slowly, they saw everything. They saw the bent blade of grass that indicated a trail. They smelled the faint whiff of tobacco that indicated a sentry. They heard the click of a rifle bolt before the trigger was pulled. The hunters became the hunted because the Americans were playing a game of movement, while the Australians were playing a game of patience. The intelligence officer spent 3 days documenting these methods. He wrote a comprehensive report detailing the scent discipline, the weapon modifications, the psychological approach, and the movement techniques. He concluded that the American doctrine of search and destroy was fundamentally flawed in this environment, and that the Australian method of patience and precision was the only viable tactic for survival. He stamped the report urgent and sent it up the chain of command. It was received, read by a staff officer in an air-conditioned office in Saigon, and promptly filed away in a cabinet of ignored ideas. The Pentagon was not interested in being told that its methods were inferior to a small Commonwealth ally. They had firepower, they had helicopters, they had napalm. They didn't need tire sandals and patience. But the jungle does not care about arrogance, and it does not read field manuals. It only respects what works. And 6 days later, in the dense, suffocating canopy of Long Con Province, the jungle was about to deliver a lesson that the 173rd Airborne Brigade would never forget. The laughter of the Green Beret captain at the Nui Dat airstrip was a distant memory now, replaced by the crack of AK-47 rounds and the screams of dying men. The American doctrine was colliding with reality, and reality was winning. The stage was set for a catastrophe, and the only thing standing between an American company and total annihilation was a 4-man patrol of idiots with sawed-off guns, moving at the speed of a shadow. The catastrophe began not with a mistake, but with a standard operating procedure. The unit moving into the kill zone was a company of the 173rd Airborne Brigade, the Sky Soldiers. These were not raw recruits. They were paratroopers, volunteers, the tip of the American spear. They were led by a West Point captain on his second tour, a man who wore a Bronze Star and believed in the overwhelming lethality of his unit. The company numbered 118 men. They moved in a standard column formation, flanked by security elements, weapons at the ready, eyes scanning the tree line. To a conventional military observer, they looked formidable. They carried M16 rifles, M60 machine guns, grenade launchers, and radios capable of summoning the wrath of God in the form of Phantom jets and 105mm howitzers. They were the best-equipped infantry force in the history of warfare. But to the Viet Cong battalion, waiting in the silence of the Long Con forest, they were not soldiers. They were a noisy, clumsy parade. The enemy had detected the Americans nearly 40 minutes before the first shot was fired. The detection was not a result of a brilliant scout or a lucky break. It was simply the result of American doctrine. The paratroopers were moving at a standard patrol pace of 2 kilometers per hour. Their boots crunched on dry leaves. Their canteens sloshed. Radio squelch broke the silence every few minutes. And they smelled. The wind was drifting from the American position toward the enemy, carrying the distinct chemical signature of insect repellent and gun oil. The Viet Cong battalion commander, sitting in a camouflaged bunker 300 meters away, had ample time to check his machine gun sectors, distribute extra ammunition, and allow his men to drink tea. He was facing a force that had announced its arrival like a guest ringing a doorbell. He waited. He let the point man pass. He let the slack man pass. He waited until the main body of the American company was fully inside the L-shaped killing zone. Then, at 11:47 a.m., he gave the signal. The jungle did not explode with a roar. It erupted with a synchronized mechanical shriek. 6 heavy machine guns opened fire simultaneously from concealed bunkers. Rocket-propelled grenades slammed into the American center, targeting the radio operators and the command group. In the first 30 seconds, the concept of American superiority evaporated. 23 paratroopers fell before they could shoulder their rifles. The air filled with red tracers, screaming metal, and the chaotic shouting of men trying to organize a defense in a blender of vegetation. The American captain, thrown to the ground by the concussion of an RPG, reacted exactly as he had been trained. He screamed for his men to return fire. He grabbed the handset of his radio. He called for artillery. He called for gunships. He did everything right according to the manual, and none of it worked. Within 8 minutes, American artillery shells were tearing apart the jungle canopy. The ground shook with the impact of high explosives. But the rounds were landing on empty terrain. The Viet Cong were dug into spider holes and tunnel systems specifically designed to weather artillery barrages. They knew exactly how the Americans would react. They knew the Americans would fire at the noise, so they fired from one position and then scrambled through trenches to another. When the Cobra gunships arrived, buzzing overhead like angry wasps, they strafed the jungle floor with miniguns and rockets. But they couldn't see the enemy. The Viet Cong were invisible, blending into the root systems, firing only when the aircraft turned away. The Americans were fighting a phantom that bit and vanished, bit and vanished. By 12:30 p.m., the situation had degraded from a firefight into a massacre. The American company had suffered over 40 casualties. They were pinned down in a tight perimeter, taking fire from 3 sides. Their ammunition was running low. The wounded were screaming for medics, who were themselves pinned down or dead. The captain, bleeding from a shrapnel wound in his leg, realized with a cold, sickening clarity that his company was going to die here. His firepower couldn't find the target. His aggression had walked him into a trap. His speed had only hastened his demise. He was fighting a war of attrition against an enemy he couldn't see, in terrain he didn't understand. It was at 12:51 p.m. that he made the call. It was a call that bruised his ego more than the shrapnel had bruised his leg. He keyed the radio frequency assigned to the Australian SAS patrol operating in the adjacent sector, the same patrol his peers had mocked days earlier. "We are pinned down," he shouted over the roar of gunfire. "Taking heavy casualties, surrounded. Request immediate assistance. Over." 4 kilometers away, in a patch of dense bamboo, an Australian sergeant named Jock lowered his radio. He looked at his 3 teammates. They were crouched in the dirt, faces smeared with green and black camouflage cream, wearing their tire sandals and holding their sawed-off L1A1s. They had heard the battle raging for an hour. They had analyzed the volume of fire and knew the Americans were in trouble. But Australian doctrine was strict: avoid decisive engagement. They were reconnaissance, not infantry. 4 men against a battalion was suicide. But the radio call changed the equation. Allied soldiers were being slaughtered. Jock keyed his mic. "Roger that, Yank. We hear you. We are moving to your location. ETA, 90 minutes. The American captain's voice cracked with panic and rage. 90 minutes? We don't have 90 minutes. You need to double-time it. We are getting chewed up. Move fast." Jock's reply was calm, flat, and absolutely non-negotiable. "Negative. If we run, we make noise. If we make noise, they hear us. If they hear us, we get ambushed, and then nobody helps you. We are moving at our pace. Out." The next hour and a half was a study in 2 different wars. In the kill zone, the Americans were fighting a war of desperation, pouring thousands of rounds into the jungle, screaming, bleeding, dying. In the surrounding jungle, the Australians were fighting a war of silence. They did not run. They did not rush. They moved with that same hydraulic, glacial patience the intelligence officer had witnessed at Nui Dat. They were not moving toward the American perimeter. They were moving toward the enemy rear. They were infiltrating the ambushers. The Australians slipped through the vegetation like smoke. They passed within 50 meters of Viet Cong sentries who were focused entirely on the noise of the American battle. They smelled the cordite and the unwashed bodies of the enemy fighters. At one point, Jock froze mid-step, his foot hovering over a root. A Viet Cong ammunition carrier sprinted across the trail 5 meters in front of him, carrying belts of machine gun ammo to the front line. The carrier didn't look left or right. He was fixated on the loud battle. He never saw the 4 muddy figures standing in the shadows, weapons raised but silent. The Australians let him pass. Killing him would have alerted the others. They were hunting bigger game. They moved deeper. They penetrated the outer ring of the Viet Cong security. They were now inside the enemy formation, a virus injected directly into the host. The sound of the battle was deafening now, but they communicated with hand signals, eyes locked on the terrain. They found what they were looking for at 14:15. Through a gap in the ferns, Jock spotted a bunker complex that was larger than the others. Antenna wires ran out of it. Runners were dashing in and out with messages. An officer in a pith helmet was pointing at a map, shouting orders to a mortar crew. It was the battalion command post. The Australian sergeant did not open fire. Firing would reveal their position, and 4 rifles, even sawed-off ones, could not take a command bunker. Instead, he pulled out his radio. He whispered coordinates. But these were not the rough grid squares the Americans had been calling in. The Americans had been calling for artillery somewhere to the north. Jock was calling for artillery on a specific tree stump 35 meters to his front. He was calling for the scalpel. "Fire mission," he whispered. "Danger close. Adjust fire." The first round whistled in. It landed 50 meters long. The Viet Cong commander didn't even flinch. Artillery had been falling randomly for hours. He assumed it was just more American noise. He didn't know that a set of eyes was watching the impact. "Drop 50, Jock whispered. "Fire for effect." The second volley did not miss. 3 105mm high-explosive shells slammed directly into the command bunker. The earth heaved. Logs and sandbags were thrown into the air. The Viet Cong battalion commander and his entire staff were vaporized in a millisecond. The nerve center of the ambush was gone. Jock shifted his gaze. Right 100, machine gun nest at the base of the banyan tree. The next volley silenced the heavy gun that had been suppressing the American medics. Left 50, mortar pit. The next volley turned the mortar team into red mist. It was a systematic dismantling. From the American perspective, it seemed like a miracle. For 2 hours, their artillery had been useless, churning up mud. Suddenly, the shells were landing with godlike precision. Every time a Viet Cong machine gun opened up, a shell landed on it 30 seconds later. The enemy fighters, who had been confident and aggressive, suddenly realized they were naked. They couldn't understand how the Americans could see them through the thick canopy. Panic began to ripple through the Viet Cong lines. Their orders stopped coming. Their heavy weapons were being picked off one by one. The invisible enemy was suddenly being hit by thunderbolts from the sky. The Viet Cong broke. It wasn't a retreat, it was a rout. Without leadership, confused by the sudden accuracy of the fire, terrified that they had been flanked by a massive force, they grabbed their weapons and fled into the deep jungle. The firing sputtered and died. The silence that returned to the clearing was heavy with the smell of smoke and blood. The American captain, his leg hastily bandaged, pulled himself up on his rifle. He looked around the shattered perimeter. The trees were shredded. Bodies lay in the tall grass. He waited for the relief column to arrive. He expected to see a company of tanks, or at least a platoon of infantry, charging through the brush to secure the area. Instead, the bushes to his north parted silently. 4 men walked out. They didn't look like soldiers. They looked like apparitions. They were covered in mud and filth. They wore tire sandals. They carried ugly, sawed-off rifles that looked like junk. They weren't breathing hard. They weren't sweating profusely. They looked as calm as if they had just taken a stroll through a park. The Australian sergeant walked up to the American captain, stopped, and uncorked his canteen. He took a slow sip, his eyes scanning the tree line, still vigilant, still hunting. "You all right, mate?" Jock asked. The American captain stared at him. He stared at the tire sandals. He stared at the sawed-off gun. He remembered the laugh he had shared with his XO at the airstrip. He remembered calling them idiots. He looked at the carnage of his own unit, 34 dead, 50 wounded. He looked at the Australians, 4 men, 0 casualties, 0 rounds fired from their rifles, yet they had just killed a battalion command staff and routed the enemy. The disparity was so vast it was almost incomprehensible. "Where are the rest of you?" the captain asked, his voice shaking. "Just us," Jock said. "We thought you might need a hand spotting the targets. You were making a bit of a mess of the landscaping." The American captain didn't laugh. He couldn't. He realized in that moment that everything he had been taught at West Point, the aggressive maneuvering, the volume of fire, the reliance on technology, had failed him. He had brought a sledgehammer to a surgery. These men had brought a needle. The idiots with the ruined guns had walked through hell without getting singed, simply because they understood the rules of the game better than the people who wrote the rule book. The aftermath of the battle was a sobering affair for the 173rd. As the medevac helicopters descended to pick up the American wounded, the Australians faded back into the jungle. They didn't wait for commendations. They didn't want to be interviewed. They had another patrol to finish. They slipped away as quietly as they had arrived, leaving the Americans to count the bodies and write the reports. But the reports were where the real conflict began. When the statistics reached Saigon, they were flagged as anomalies. An American company with massive air and artillery support achieves a kill ratio of 1-to-1. A 4-man Australian patrol with sawed-off rifles achieves a kill ratio of effectively infinity, having destroyed the enemy leadership without firing a shot. The Pentagon analysts couldn't process it. It didn't fit the models. They tried to categorize the Australian success as luck or terrain advantage. They ignored the fundamental truth. The Australians were fighting a different war. However, the enemy was not ignoring it. Weeks later, intelligence units captured a Viet Cong document from a tunnel complex near the Cambodian border. It was a tactical directive issued by the North Vietnamese High Command. It contained specific instructions for engaging Allied forces. The section on Americans was standard. Wait for the noise. Ambush from close range. Hug their belt to neutralize air power. Retreat when firepower becomes overwhelming. The section on the Australians was different. It was short, terrified, and explicit. It read, "Avoid contact with the Australians. Do not engage unless trapped. They do not sleep. They do not make noise. They are the Rung, jungle ghosts. If you engage the Americans, you will likely survive. If you engage the Australians, you will die." This document was the ultimate validation of the idiots at Nui Dat. The enemy feared the hacksaw more than the howitzer. They feared the tire sandal more than the combat boot. They feared the silence more than the roar. The American military machine continued to grind on, churning up the land, counting bodies, measuring success in tons of bombs dropped. But in the quiet corners of the officers' clubs, the men who had been there, the men like the captain of the 173rd, spoke in hushed tones about the ghosts who walked through walls. They stopped laughing at the sawed-off guns. They stopped making jokes about the hygiene. They started to wonder if perhaps, just perhaps, the primitives were actually the most advanced warriors on the battlefield. But the lesson wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. The Australian SAS paid a price for their invisibility that the American doctrine didn't account for. To become a ghost, you have to give up a part of your humanity. You have to shut down the noise in your head. You have to become a predator. And as the war dragged on, the men who lived in the silence found it harder and harder to come back to the noise of the real world. The story of the rescue was legendary, but the story of what it cost to be that good was a secret kept in the quiet stares of the men who came home and found they could still hear the jungle breathing. The true measure of the Australian success in Long Con was not found in the immediate body count of the battle, nor in the relief of the American survivors. It was found 3 weeks later, buried in a cache of documents discovered in a tunnel complex near the Nui Din Hills. Intelligence officers from the 1st Australian Task Force spent days translating the rice paper journals and tactical directives of the Viet Cong 274th Regiment. What they found was a vindication that no medal could equal. Among the standard propaganda and logistical notes was a specific standing order regarding the Australians. The directive was stark, fearful, and utterly unlike the instructions given for fighting Americans. For the U.S. forces, the Viet Cong manuals were filled with aggressive diagrams: how to hug their belt to neutralize air power, how to ambush their noisy columns, how to exploit their impatience. The Americans were viewed as a dangerous but manageable natural disaster, loud, predictable, and survivable if you followed the rules. But for the Australians, the instruction was different. The captured directive read, "Do not engage the Australians unless you outnumber them 10 to 1, or unless you are trapped. They do not sleep. They do not make noise. They are patience itself. If you shoot at an American, he calls for an airstrike and you can hide. If you shoot at an Australian, he hunts you down and you die." The document used a specific term that rippled through the intelligence community: Rung. It meant phantoms of the jungle. It was an admission that the technological superiority of the United States had been checkmated by peasant guerrillas. But the peasant guerrillas had been checkmated by a few hundred men in tire sandals who understood the jungle better than they did. The enemy was terrified not of the B-52 bomber, but of the 4-man patrol that could sit motionless for 12 hours, waiting for a single leaf to rustle. This intuitive mastery of the environment was not an accident of training. It was the result of a cultural inheritance that the Americans had entirely overlooked. The root of the Australian SAS's supernatural ability to move and track lay in a wisdom that predated the Vietnam War by 40,000 years. While the Americans were consulting computer models and ballistics tables, the Australians were consulting the Aboriginal trackers of the Northern Territory. Long before deployment, SAS troopers had learned from indigenous Australians whose ancestors had survived in the harshest bushland on Earth without metal or gunpowder. They learned that the land tells a story if you know how to read it. They learned that a broken twig is a shout, that the absence of bird calls is a warning siren, and that the human eye is drawn to movement, so survival depends on stillness. The American doctrine was built on the concept of conquering nature, bulldozing the jungle, paving the roads, burning the canopy with defoliants. It was an adversarial relationship with the environment. The Aboriginal philosophy, adopted by the SAS, was one of integration. You do not fight the bush, you become the bush. You move with the wind, not against it. You step where the ground is hard. You exist within the flow of the ecosystem. This was why the idiots at Nui Dat had sawed off their rifles and worn enemy sandals. They weren't trying to be soldiers in a parade. They were trying to be predators in an ecosystem. They understood that in the jungle, the most dangerous animal is not the biggest one, but the one you never see. However, this transformation from soldier to phantom carried a price that was never listed in the after-action reports. The cost of the Rung doctrine was not paid in ammunition or fuel, but in the psychological fragmentation of the men who practiced it. To operate at that level of hypervigilance, to suppress every human instinct for comfort, noise, and social interaction, required a rewiring of the brain that did not easily reverse when the war ended. The troopers who spent weeks moving at 100 meters an hour, whose entire existence narrowed to the sensory input of a 10-meter kill zone, came home changed. They carried the silence with them. Veterans spoke, years later, of the inability to function in the noise of civilian life. They sat in pubs with their backs to the wall, eyes scanning the door, analyzing threats that weren't there. They couldn't sleep because the silence of a suburban bedroom felt dangerous. In the jungle, silence meant the enemy was stalking you. The smell of soap, which they had trained themselves to despise as a death sentence, became nauseating. They had turned themselves into perfect killing machines, tuning their biology to the frequency of a predator, and then were expected to turn it off like a light switch. The tragedy of the Australian SAS in Vietnam was that they were too good at their jobs. They went so deep into the jungle, physically and psychologically, that some part of them never came back out. There was also a moral ambiguity to their methods that American commanders, bound by stricter rules of engagement and heavy media scrutiny, found difficult to swallow. The Australian ambush was not a firefight, it was an execution. When a patrol waited for hours for a Viet Cong unit to enter a kill zone, there was no warning, no attempt to take prisoners, no escalation of force. It was a sudden, violent erasure of life at point-blank range using the devastating power of the modified 7.62 mm rifles. It was intimate violence. The Americans killed from a distance with artillery and bombs, a detached, industrial form of warfare. The Australians killed from 5 meters away, often seeing the fear in the enemy's eyes before the trigger broke. It was a brutal, personal intimacy that left scars on the soul. The efficiency of the 1-to-500 kill ratio was a statistical marvel, but for the men behind the trigger, it was a heavy burden of accumulated ghosts. The legacy of the Rung was slow to permeate the massive bureaucracy of the U.S. military, but it eventually took root. It took decades, and another generation of failures before the lessons of Long Con were truly internalized. In the aftermath of the Vietnam War, as the U.S. military licked its wounds and analyzed its defeat, the Australian model began to be whispered about in the halls of Fort Bragg and the Pentagon. The creation and refinement of units like Delta Force and the expansion of the Navy SEALs' capabilities in the 1980s drew heavily on the concepts of small unit autonomy, indigenous training, and environmental adaptation that the Australians had perfected. The American captain who had mocked the sawed-off rifles and the tire sandals survived the war, but the lesson of that day defined the rest of his career. He retired as a colonel, and in his memoirs, he wrote not of the grand battles or the air assaults, but of the silence. He wrote about the hubris of technology. "We thought we could buy victory with copper and lead," he wrote. "We thought that because we had radios that could talk to the moon, we knew where we were. But the men who saved us didn't have technology. They had patience. They had humility. They respected the jungle enough to listen to it. We died because we were too loud to hear the truth." The ultimate vindication of the Australian method is etched into the history of special operations warfare. The L1A1 bitch, the sawed-off rifle that looked like garbage, is now recognized as a precursor to the modern carbines used by special forces worldwide. Short, maneuverable, designed for the reality of close-quarters combat rather than the theory of the rifle range. The scent discipline, the tracking, the slow movement, these are now foundational pillars of elite reconnaissance training. The idiots were actually visionaries. They had looked at the intractable problem of jungle warfare and solved it by stripping away the artifice of the modern soldier. In the end, the story of the Australian SAS in Vietnam is a parable about the limits of power. The United States brought the might of the 20th century to Vietnam: the jets, the sensors, the defoliants, the computers. They tried to bend the reality of the war to fit their doctrine. The Australians brought tire sandals and sawed-off guns. They bent their doctrine to fit the reality of the war. One force came home with a trauma of defeat and a casualty list that scarred a nation. The other came home with a kill ratio of 500 to 1 and a reputation that terrified the enemy into avoidance. The jungle has grown back over the battlefield of Long Con. The bunkers are collapsed. The craters from the American artillery are filled with rain and ferns. But if you walk there today, the locals might still tell stories of the war years. They don't talk much about the loud helicopters or the bombing runs. They talk about the time when the forest had eyes. They talk about the soldiers who left no footprints. They talk about the Rung, And in the military academies of the world, where young officers study the art of war, the lesson remains waiting for anyone humble enough to learn it. You cannot kill what you cannot find, and you cannot find what has become the world itself. The laughter at the airstrip was the sound of an empire forgetting that in the dark, a hacksaw is more useful than a howitzer, and silence is the loudest sound of all.